It's Saturday, November 2nd, 2024, and we are 2 days away from the election. Welcome to today's Make It Make Sense mini-episode. I'm Grant Herms. Today in the show, I thought the day after I talked about undecided voters, it might be a good time to talk about another group of voters, the liars. So, a brand new Axios survey, which Axios calls its Vibes survey, which is just kind of funny because it has kind of felt like we've just been running on vibes in the last 3 months here. But anyway, the survey found that about a quarter of Americans have lied to someone about who they're voting for, and just over 1 in 5 said they've considered lying about it to someone they're close to. That's a pretty big change from how we used to think about voting. And while yes, our votes have always been considered private, most people, when asked in previous election cycles, didn't feel the need to lie and didn't worry about the reaction to our answer to that. Now, that has changed a little bit since Donald Trump has been a public politician. Even going back to 2016, there was a significant amount of people who said they weren't voting for Trump who then secretly said they were voting for Trump, less so in 2020 and even less so now in 2024. But we'll get to that change in just a minute here, because the things that have changed is particularly for younger voters, and the generational divide on this idea is stark. So 38% of millennials and 48% of Gen Z said they lied to someone like a loved one or a friend, compared to 17% of Gen X and 6% of the boomer generation and older. A couple things are going on here. First, millennials and Gen Z tend to live in places and work jobs and have lives in which they interact with more people who are different than them. So someone close to them, like a friendly coworker, might bring up an opportunity to lie about this thing because they may not have the same beliefs. Gen X and older generations are the beating heart of what's been called the Great Sort. It's essentially this phenomenon that happened in America over the last 20 years or so, where people have begun to sort themselves into neighborhoods and personal lives where they are way more like their neighbors than generations before them. It's things like a product of being able to buy a house and move to a suburb, which also has the long tail of white flight from large cities and towns and places across the country, but they tend to live in a bubble a little bit more than younger generations. The other thing, and I think this is more telling about why we're seeing this rise in lying about voting, millennials and Gen Z have essentially only known a world in which things have been hyper-partisan and hyper-polarized. For Gen Z, a lot of them, the only political world they've ever known is one with Donald Trump in it. And I mean, think about that. Donald Trump, regardless of how you feel about the guy, changed everything about how we understand the qualifications for the presidency, the character we associate with the president, and I think the most important, the permission to use violence in response to political disagreements and outcomes. That means that those youngest voters, about 18 to 27 years old, are the most sensitive to political disputes and the idea that they might be judged for their political views, and they've only known a world in which there is a real possibility that someone might react violently to that opinion, even those closest to them. And younger voters tend to be less confrontational compared to older voters, even in their daily lives. There are a lot of theories as to why this is. Some of them are, things like they're just kind of fried from being online all the time and seeing more conflict there, so they want to avoid it whenever they can. Or that because they're more online, they're not used to confrontation in person, and so they try to shut that down in person because they're just not good at it. Or the one that I personally like is they're better versed in signs of how conflict and even violent conflict starts and escalates because they grew up with the internet where people are more likely to be confrontational. And because they spend so much time online, they're better at noticing those signals when they happen. And that sort of risk aversion and coping skill is something we can see directly when you look at who is hiding their vote the most. It's women, and mostly young women. So for weeks now, there has been this trend online of women saying they're on their way to vote early to cancel out their boyfriend or husband or parents' vote. And while these are meant to be funny in a sort of if I don't laugh, I'll cry kind of a way, I think it really speaks to this current political moment and the gender gap that I've talked about before being wider than we've ever seen before, coming in around 34 points. And again, the gender gap is the difference between how men and women are voting. So more women than men are voting for Harris, and more men than women are voting for Trump this time around. You take the difference of those numbers, you get 34% and 34-point swing there. And in 2020 and 2016, the gender gap was about half of what it is now. This has become so prevalent that there have been a ton of articles written about how conservative and conservative-leaning men are struggling to find dates, and that the majority of young women are less likely to date a Trump supporter, with 38% who said they were Republicans, and among college-educated women, that number shoots up to 75% saying they wouldn't date a Trump supporter, with 52% of Republican women with a college education saying they wouldn't date a Trump supporter. And most often, they say it's about things like their physical safety, their personal freedoms, and their reproductive rights, and being afraid that a Trump-supporting man would take those things away from them. And it's here that I want to say the reaction from men has been wild. Because it's like, fellas, if your reaction to learning that this many women, including many women who would normally agree with your values, find your views repulsive, maybe it's time to check those views. Instead, the reaction has been to say it's not us, it's the system that needs overhauling, which I would argue says more about how people feel about women in general than any one political opinion. Anyway, regardless of all that, Democrats have gone all in, not just getting women to vote, but also reiterating that their votes are private no matter what the men in their lives say. Former Republican Representative Liz Cheney has been on the campaign trail for Harris for weeks now, saying this exact same thing. Here she was just last weekend on CBS's Sunday show, Face the Nation.
I have to say it's a little striking. It sounds a little 1950s or 1970s. Are you really hearing from female voters that they're afraid to tell their spouses who they're voting for?
Yeah, you know what we're seeing is so important and so interesting. You're seeing a real coalition of women who are pro-life and pro-choice come together to support Vice President Harris. And that's because we've seen some of the draconian laws that have been passed in places like Texas and North Carolina that are preventing women from getting life-saving health care, preventing women from getting medical care that, will ensure that if they have a miscarriage that they can have babies again. Just fundamentally a set of circumstances that can't be maintained. And so you have a growing coalition supporting Vice President Harris. You certainly have had many Republicans who are speaking out to endorse her, which again is unprecedented. And there are also many Republicans and independents who are saying, look, I don't want to bring the wrath of, Donald Trump and J.D. Vance down on me, so I'm going to vote my conscience. I'm not going to talk about it. And we obviously encourage that. Your vote is a secret vote. You should do what you know is right. And I think you're going to have, frankly, a lot of men and women who will go into the voting booth and will vote their conscience, will vote for Vice President Harris. They may not ever say anything publicly, but the results will speak for themselves.
Now, Cheney has said a similar version of this, like I said, at a number of rallies and town halls in swing states across the country, and early voting seems to suggest that there has been a flood of new Democratic women voting early or by mail, far outpacing men by nearly 7 million votes. Now, the last thing that I want to talk about is something we've seen for a few years now, but it was really borne out in another part of that Axios survey. A third of Americans aren't close to someone now because of their politics. And those numbers, again, jumped with younger voters, with 44% of Gen Z and 47% of millennials saying they're not as close as they used to be with a family member because of political views, whether theirs or that person's. Now, there's been a lot of reaction to this specific thing, or people going no contact with family over politics over the last few years, as just how sad that young people can't just get along, or young people are overreacting. But I don't think that's what's happening. More than ever before, more people than ever before see our current political moment as a real struggle for their futures, and not just in a metaphorical sense, but the literal physical way that they live their lives right now and how they want to physically live them in the future. We've never seen or known a political environment that for this many people, the stakes are this high. And that goes deeper than just our votes. So we shouldn't be surprised when people cut out people from their lives, or they start hiding who they're voting for from the people that they love the most. Okay, that is it for for today's MIMS Mini. Please rate and review the show on whatever podcast app you're listening to this on. Make sure you're following along because, like I've been saying, the mini episodes are going to be over after the election, so you'll just be getting those weekly full episodes on Friday, unless barring things get really crazy after the election, and then I'll keep doing the minis. But I don't want you to miss out on any of these episodes, so make sure you're following on whatever podcast app you're on. Like, subscribe, and hit the bell for notifications on YouTube so you don't miss out on anything there. You can also subscribe to the Make It Make Sense Substack, where I'll have a lot of the stuff that was in the minis in that Substack. It's just $5 a month, and you'll get all this great content, including extended interviews with guests, like my guest yesterday, Mary Anna Mancuso, where we talked way more about how climate change is already affecting how people vote. And last but certainly not least, please continue to share the show on social media. It's MIMS News Pod. That's MIMS News Pod, all one word on every platform. I am at Grant Herms on X and at Grant Herms TV on everything else. Thank you so much for listening today. I'm Grant Herms, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.